I don't believe myself to be superstitious, but working on this video, it constantly brought this chill running down my spine. There is something mystical about Gogol and V. Nikolai Gogol was born 1809 in a small village near Poltava, at the time part of the Russian Empire. His father was a civil servant, but then he retired and opened an amateur theatre. His mother, she married at 14 years old, she was still playing with dolls at the time, and she occupied herself with family matters. Nikolai was the oldest sibling to survive, and he had 4 sisters. He was an average scholar at the gymnasium, but he had a great passion for writing and acting. His peers even believed that he could make it on stage. Gogol's eccentricities started showing in the gymnasium even. His peers said that he'd lock himself up in his room and start making animal noises. And when asked about it, he said that he preferred the company of pigs to human company. Relatable? His father died when Nikolai was 15 years old, and in order to support his family, he signed over his inheritance to his sisters, and upon the completion of his studies at the gymnasium, he moved to St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg wasn't particularly welcoming to Gogol. He struggled to find a job, and when he published his first poem in one of the magazines under a pseudonym, it was so heavily criticized for its naivete that Gogol bought out all of the copies that he could find and burned them all. He did manage to find a clerical position at the very bottom of the food chain, and he continued to write. He understood that his strength might be in his heritage, so he wrote to his mother asking her to send him all of the folk tales that she knew, all of the folkways, the lifestyle of the Cossacks of Malorossia, a very dated term that described a part of the Russian Empire that is now mostly Ukraine with bits of Poland and Russia. And 1830, he published a story, An Evening Before Ivan Kupala, or St. John's Eve, that upon summary workings become part of the Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, 1831. Evenings provide a glance at the everyday life of the Ukrainian villages of that time, where everyday life merges with the mystical and the supernatural. These tales were praised by many notable authors and critics of that time, for example, Alexander Pushkin. The second part of Evenings got released next year, and thus Gogol was now accepted in all of the literary circles of that time. And 1834, he managed to get a professorial position in St. Petersburg University. According to memoirs of his students and his colleagues, he was a rather lousy teacher. He would often skip classes, or when he did come to class, his lectures were incredibly boring. But he did use this position in order to get access to the archives. Gogol finished the Malorossia period of his work with a series called Mirgorod, in spirit a continuation of Evenings, but with a tone shift to darker and less whimsical themes. 1835, a collection Arabesques started the St. Petersburg period of Gogol's works. It included, for example, the famous The Portrait and Diary of a Madman. That same year, Gogol also started working on Dead Souls. 1835, he also took a pass at writing a play. Some say that the idea for it came from Alexander Pushkin. Supposedly, Gogol wrote to him asking him for a plot, and Pushkin suggested this tale of a man posing as a high government official. The Government Inspector was read in literary circles 1836, but to get it on stage, it took a lot of work and a lot of connections, but it did make it to stage in Alexandrovsky Theatre in St. Petersburg. They say that Tsar Nikolai I liked it so much that he saw it multiple times and also sent his ministers to see it. The critics and the public were not in agreement on the play, however. Some believed it to be too harsh of a criticism on the Russian society, others believed it to be a farce. Gogol, who never took criticism particularly well, was very much distraught about the receipt of his play, and he fled to Europe. He actually did the same thing when his first poem failed. He fled to Germany at the time. And it's a good time as any to say that Gogol was odd. He likely suffered from some kind of mental disorder. He was incredibly antisocial. He didn't like meeting new people, and if somebody showed up who he didn't know, he would just run away. That's actually relatable. And Gogol was his happiest in Italy. The contrast of the sunny blue skies of Italy to grey and rainy St. Petersburg is quite obvious. Gogol was also very fond of local foods. His love for pasta is very well documented. And at the time in Europe, there were quite a few Russian immigrants, or just Russians who could just live there, so Gogol was happily accepted in those circles. But being in Europe also provided some perspective on Russia for him. He continued working in Italy on Dead Souls, that was completed in 1841. The story of Chichikov traveling across Russia, buying out peasants who are actually dead but very much alive on paper, it was supposed to have another 2 parts to it. Story has it that Gogol was heavily inspired by Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, and in the next 2 parts, Chichikov was supposed to see the error of his ways and change. But 1845, Gogol burned the manuscript of the second part of the Dead Souls, along with some other manuscripts. He became sullen and closed off. He has always suffered from various medical diseases, real or imaginary. He was a hypochondriac. But in later parts of his life, his mental state was suffering more and more. He took the death of Alexander Pushkin very harshly, and his friend, female friend and confidant, Ekaterina Khomykova, passed away around the same time. And in order to combat it all, Gogol turned to God. He had a minister friend, a Father Matvey, who encouraged Gogol to renounce everything, to renounce his friends, his work, in order to find absolution. During his childhood, his mother would vividly describe what would happen to him if he led a virtuous life and how great heaven is, and just as vividly she described the horrors of hell, likely solidifying the fear of death that Gogol carried throughout his life. But in this later part of his life, Gogol also believed that it was his sacred duty to help others. He even published a book, selected passages from correspondence with friends, where he got really preachy and he was trying to help others find meaning and God. 1848, Gogol traveled to Jerusalem, but was incredibly disappointed by the trip and returned to Russia the next year. He tried to recreate the second tome of the Dead Souls, but his mental state was not improving. He was in this constant fear of death, and 1852 he stopped eating altogether. He claimed to hear voices, he became delirious, and he passed away February 21st, 1852, and the cause of death is unknown. Gogol throughout his life was deathly afraid of being buried alive. He requested that he is only put to ground when first signs of decomposition appear. And he was buried near Danilov Monastery. But 1931, almost 100 years after his death, his remains had to be moved to Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. That created a lot of rumors because all of the literary elite of that time wanted to peek into the coffin. Some claimed that Gogol was lying in an uncomfortable position, head turned, and that spurred on the conspiracy that Gogol was actually buried alive. Others claimed that the skull was missing altogether. Nothing to support either claim, by the way. Gogol also never married nor had any notable love affairs that spurred on the rumors and conspiracies around his homosexuality or alternatively his virginity. Nothing to support either. But what actually struck me is the surface similarities between Nikolai Gogol and Edgar Allan Poe. They are literally the same person. Can we start the conspiracy theory now? They were born the same year, 1809, died like 3 years difference between them under unknown circumstances for the both of them. They were both deathly afraid of being buried alive, and their works actually are similar in this gothic mystical nature of them. They even look somewhat similar. Well, not really, but come on. I'm sorry, that was a tangent. It's just that I read V and some of Edgar Allan Poe on the same day, and it's striking. Out of Russian lit, Gogol suffers most in translation. Not only is his language incredibly colorful, he throws in a lot of epithets, descriptors and such, but he also adds a lot of local flavor into it, and not just valinkis and samovars. The early Malorossia stories are packed with Ukrainian words, and in the Russian text it only adds to the flavor of the piece and the atmosphere and helps you orient yourself. And even the title, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, well, hutor can mean farm. I would argue that Gogol meant a village, a second meaning to hutor, but he also didn't use the Russian деревня or поселок to describe it. Hutor is something very distinctive. And some words are not known to us even, but as you read it, you understand that lulka is a smoke pipe, you understand what the shinok means, what kuren is, and all of these words. And it is important because Gogol is describing, accurately or not, the lifestyle of the part of the Russian Empire that is now Ukraine. The translation of Taras Bulba that I read is okay. The translation that I have for V is not. They have foregone with using the Ukrainian words in translate, and because of it, the text reads much more bland than it did in Russian. Three students of the seminary during their vacation get lost somewhere in the countryside. Long after the nightfall, they stumble upon a house in the middle of nowhere and ask for shelter. The old woman first doesn't want to let them in altogether, but finally succumbs and puts them in different rooms. During the night, the old woman comes to the philosopher Hamabrut and straddles him like a broom and flies off with him into the night, and so Hamabrut understands that she is a witch. They fly over the countryside, but soon Hama starts chanting prayers and exorcisms, thus weakening the witch, and he manages to leap on her back instead. They come to the ground, and Hama manages to grab a log and bashes her with it repeatedly until she cannot take it anymore, and they stumble upon the ground. As dawn breaks, Hama sees that she is no longer an old woman, but a beautiful young girl. Homa flees back to Kiev, but soon hears a story that the daughter of one of the Cossack chiefs returned home beaten half to death and is now at death's door. Her last request is that the prayers at her corpse to be read for 3 nights by one of the seminarians, our Hamabrut. The Cossack chief has already sent a kibitka to pick up Homa, so they travel to this distant village. Homa contemplates running away on the way to the village upon arrival, but the Cossack chief tells him that there is no way to run. The girl dies on the night of Homa's arrival, and when the Cossack chief takes him to see her corpse, Homa is first taken in by her beauty, but then recognizes the witch. As she's taken to the church in her coffin, the villagers start to gossip about her. Seemingly everybody but her father knew her to be a witch. On the first night, Homa is taken to the church and locked inside. The scene is dark and frightening, him alone in an empty church with this coffin. And then the dead girl rises from her coffin. In fear, Homa draws a circle around himself and starts chanting prayers. The dead girl tries to grab for Homa, but cannot see him. And then her coffin starts flying around the church. But at dawnbreak and the first rooster call, the dead girl gets back into her coffin, lid shut. The next day, everything seems like a dream to Homa. He goes back that night thinking that it's only frightening on the first night, so he can make it through. He draws the circle around himself and starts chanting prayers, only looking at the book, and once he picks up, the dead body is in front of him, clacking her teeth. Then he hears wings screeching, something beating on the windows and the doors of the church, but upon the first rooster call, everything stops. In the morning, Homa is barely alive, he's gone grey overnight. He tries to flee from this hutor, but is brought back. On the third night, he goes back to the church, draws the circle around himself and starts chanting. The coffin lid flies off and the corpse rises. All sorts of creatures break the windows and doors of the church and pour into it. None can see Homa or find him. And then the corpse calls for V. The creatures bring in V, and he requests that his eyelids to be lifted so he could see. Homa's inner voice tells him not to look up, but he cannot help himself and looks up, and so V can see him now. All creatures pounce on Homa, and he falls to the ground dead. As the rooster calls, all creatures try to flee from the church, but it is already the second call, they've missed the first one, so all creatures get stuck in windows and doors. And dead Homa lies on the ground. His friends in Kiev, hearing the story, speculate that had he not been afraid, the witch couldn't have touched him and he would have survived. V is one of, if not the first horror story in Russian literature. It carries a lot of Gothic imagery in it. Gothic fiction got popular in Europe late 18th century, but it never caught up in Russia. V is probably the most famous example of it in Russian literature. There are a few staples of the genre: environment of fear, terror, misery, presence of the supernatural, setting in a remote castle or some other sinister building, vengeful persecution or murder, morally grey protagonist, and a damsel in distress. Well, tick, tick, tick. We're only really missing a damsel in distress, and since Homa faints from time to time, I think he could carry that burden for us. V also takes a detour from all the previous works written by Gogol at that point. For example, in the evenings, that has similar motifs to V, like the coexistence of the supernatural and evil with the people. But in evenings, the evil is defeated more often than not. In The Nightmare Before Christmas, for example, our protagonist manages to subdue the devil and make him do his bidding. These tales have a fairy tale quality to them. They talk of witches, demons, and mermaids that are quite scary in the Slavic folklore. Oh, sidebar, mermaids in Slavic folklore used to have legs for the longest time because they were believed to be the drowned maidens, and they were depicted sitting in the trees, for example. And all of these creatures can be comical or threatening, but there is always a way to trick them, to subdue them, to overcome them. We get a happy ending, even if it has a sinister twist. Here in V, evil straight up wins. Homa is not able to overcome the combined sources of evil, and he gives his life. And this theme of good versus evil is very much present, but arguably the thing that Homa is really facing is his own fear. The descriptors for scary, terrible, or horrific are all over the text. The terrifying beauty of the dead witch, how horrifying her corpse is, and how Homa does things out of fear. The philosopher became frightened, especially when he noticed that her eyes flashed with some extraordinary light. He felt a demonically sweet feeling. He felt some piercing, some languidly terrible pleasure. It often seemed to him as if his heart were no longer there at all, and in fear he would clutch at it with his hand. The philosopher stopped in the hall for a moment to blow his nose, and then with some unaccountable fear crossed the threshold. Yet in them, in these same features, he saw something terribly piercing, such terrible, dazzling beauty. In fear, he drew a circle around himself. The philosopher still could not come to his senses and kept glancing fearfully at the witcher's crumpled dwelling. And mind, in Russian, more often than not, it's one descriptor for scary. Sometimes Gogol uses the synonyms like horror, but strashny is all over the text. This is the passage from the third night. Highlighted are the words for scary. Literary Russian does not normally allow the use of the same word so close within the text, but Gogol uses it intentionally as to portray this terror that Homa feels. And Homa was likely supposed to conquer his fear, but failed. Breathless, he crashed to the ground, and straightway the spirit flew out of him in terror. And his friends stated as fact in the end, "No, I know why he perished, because he got scared. If he hadn't been scared, the witch couldn't have done anything to him." And Homa as a protagonist is an interesting choice. First and foremost, Homa is called a philosopher. That's the nickname for his second to last years of studies in the seminary. They were taught philosophy. In their last year, they were taught theology, thus they were called theologists. But despite his studies at the seminary, he's not that close to God. He's apathetic, he's lazy, he relies on the events playing themselves out. He also likes to eat and drink quite a bit. After his first encounter with the witch, he only feels better after a good meal. But there is something about him that allows him to survive for the longest time against witches and ghouls. He only succumbs on the last night. Critics look at religious beliefs of Gogol and interpret Homa's downfall as the fall of the religious beliefs in people, where witches and ghouls are just metaphors for people's sins. People use a lot of references to the devil in their speech. They've allowed the church to become abandoned, and even our seminarist does not turn to prayers or God, but to food instead. And in the end, Homa lets in the most deadly sin into him when he looks at V, and that's why he falls. If you wanted to draw a moral out of this, then Homa's story serves as a warning for people as to what's going to happen if they forget Christianity and its teachings. Gogol also draws a lot from folklore and folks' beliefs. For example, the comparison that we can draw is with the fairy tale lore. There was a folklorist called Prop who analyzed the fairy tales and came up with a number of different scenarios that occur in all fairy tales, not just Slavic ones. And one of the motifs is hero being tested as he enters the woods to retrieve something or to defeat a dragon or something. According to Prop, it was a depiction of the coming-of-age initiation ritual for boys, but he also believed that when the hero goes into the woods, he crosses over into a different world, nominally the afterlife. And if he is successful in his quest, he is able to return to the world of the living. Here in V, we see a similar motif when our heroes in the very beginning travel in the countryside. They seemingly cross over into a different reality, the world of the supernatural. Everywhere there was nothing but steppe, where it seemed no one passed. The travelers made another effort to move forward a bit, but everywhere was the same wilderness. And the philosopher tried shouting, but his voice was completely muffled on all sides and met no response. Only a little later came a faint wailing that resembled the howling of a wolf. And when they do, they encounter the house of a witch. Another example of the same principle comes later in the text. A staple of the Gothic fictions, the event normally takes place somewhere in a remote abandoned castle or monastery. Here, the church, look at it, it also stands far away from the hutor, seemingly abandoned, all dark and gloomy and quite scary. No marriages, no christenings, no nothing happened in here for years. The blackened wooden church, adorned with green moss and topped by 3 conical cupolas, stood desolate almost at the end of the village. One could see it was long since any service had been celebrated in it. The church also stands on this threshold between this world and the afterlife. Another divide that Homa needs to either close or cross over. But the church that should be the place of God now stands abandoned, dark and mysterious. Gogol constantly uses words black and dark to describe it. And especially in the end, when all of the evil creatures and ghouls get stuck in the windows and the walls, the very image of the bastardization of the house of God. The creatures were defeated, but at what cost? The frightened spirits rushed pell-mell for the windows and doors in order to fly out quickly, but nothing doing. And so they stayed there, stuck indoors and windows. When the priest came in, he stopped at the sight of such a disgrace in God's sanctuary, and did not dare serve a panihida in such a place. So the church remained forever, with monsters stuck in its doors and windows, overgrown with forest roots, weeds, wild blackthorn, and no one now can find the path to it. But look at the last spoken line in this story. Here in Kiev, the women sitting in the marketplace are all witches. While it reads as a joke, we were just presented with an actual God-honest witch. So it can also be read as these creatures, they are no longer living in this far-off part of the country in a different reality, but they are very much among us. Gogol also draws a lot from folk tales and superstitions. The creatures and the evil spirits, they all come from Slavic folklore. The witches, the mermaids, the ghouls, they are all present. Witches, for example, differ in various parts of Russia and Ukraine. Some depict them as old women, scary and ugly. Some depict them as young, beautiful women. Gogol just decides not to choose and uses both. The witch also appears to be a vampire. She is described as such by the villagers. She grabbed the baby, bit its throat, and began drinking its blood. The ultimate boss, the V, is not a popular creature in the folklore. With a sidelong glance, he saw them leading in some squat, hefty, splay-footed man. He was black earth all over. His earth-covered legs and arms snake out like strong, sinewy roots. Heavily he trod, stumbling all the time. His long eyelids were lowered to the ground. With horror, Homa noticed that the face on him was made of iron. Some believe that Gogol created these since no creature by that name has existed before him. He called him chief of gnomes, but Slavic folklore doesn't really have gnomes. There are similar creatures to V in all sorts of places. In Slavic, Celtic and Uranian folklore, this theme of heavy eyelids that need to be lifted with the help of others, but it's not the most popular of creatures. So it's somewhat agreed that V comes from Gogol. Some superstitions and legends that Gogol uses are: there is a tale that if a corpse suddenly shows blood, that means that its murderer is nearby. In V, it even seemed to him that a tear rolled from under her right eyelash, and when it stopped on her cheek, he made it out clearly that it was a drop of blood. Another is that a rooster call chases away the evil spirits, likely because the rooster call is associated with the dawnbreak and all evil creatures are existing in the night. In V, for 3 nights, all demons flee at the rooster call. But just then came the distant crowing of a cock. The corpse sunk back into the coffin and the coffin lid slammed shut. If an icon falls, there's going to be a death in the household. On the 3rd night, when creatures rush into the church, all icons fall to the ground. Wind whirled through the church, icons fell to the floor, broken glass dropped from the windows. Going into the kitchen, all those who carried the coffin started touching the stove, something people in Little Russia have custom of doing after they see a dead body. This is also a known tradition as to not bring death into the household. I also wanted to mention language. Gogol uses a lot of Ukrainian words in the Russian text, so much so that there is even a little dictionary at the end for us to use. The English translation that I have translates all of it into plain English, thus the text loses a lot of its color and uniqueness. There is a difference between the hutor and the farm, and I do believe that translations need to retain that element of the text. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is the thematical use of language. I've already covered the fear motif, but for example, the good versus evil is also in the text. The godly and the demonic are both present, sometimes even in the same sentence. By God, the philosopher said, stopping again. It's as dark as the devil's fist. And a small thing, but quite important, is the way that the dead witch is described. She's called Panichka, a young unmarried girl up to her death. That's how Cossacks describe her as well. On the 1st night, when the dead witch rises from her coffin, she's called she. On the 2nd night, she becomes the dead body. On the 3rd night, she's the corpse. Russian has gendered nouns, so the pronouns also change from she to it, thus dehumanizing her. Something that needs to be mentioned is that there is an erotic reading of the text. It all stems from the scene when the witch rides Homa and flies away with him, and people just read it as she rides him. And to be fair, if you read that scene in a particular tone of your voice, it can read quite sexual. There is a lot of moaning involved, especially when she turns into a young woman, and Homa describes this devilish pleasure that overcame him. Before him lay a beauty with disheveled, luxurious braid and long, pointy eyelashes. Insensibly, she spread her bare white arms and moaned, looking up with tear-filled eyes. And this Freudian reading, it's taken to different places and degrees. For example, V can be interpreted as the girl's father who comes in to punish Homa. There is also an interpretation where, after this romantic union, the scene at the church is actually a dark wedding and V is a penis. Yeah. I personally prefer a more classical reading of the story as a horror/mystical story, but if we want to go down the route of the sexual interpretation, I much prefer to read it as not a romantic union, but as a rape, because that makes more sense with the rest of the text. But regardless, V holds a very special place in the Russian literature pantheon as a first horror story and all. But I genuinely recommend that you check out something by Gogol. He is an incredible author and quite special in the way that he writes and the stories that he chooses to write as well.